Alright, yeah, and welcome back to some more Magic Duels. So, apologies for the late upload of this video. I did have plans to make a joke deck for Monday, and then it turned out to be a joke. Not in the funny kind of way, just in the really bad kind of way. So, tried to fix it, couldn't fix it, might do it in the future. But, instead, I ended up doing a white weenie deck. So, let's have a look at the deck, shall we? So, white weenie is essentially an archetype based around small white creatures, and you essentially just storm your opponent out by putting too much pressure on the board, and they just can't handle it. So, we use cheap creatures like Expedition Envoy later down the line. We've got ourselves some Exert cards from the new Armaket set, and ways of making them not stay tapped with like Always Watchings and Trials, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. Hopefully you enjoyed. Let's have a look at the deck, shall we? So leading off, we've got ourselves an Expedition Envoy. So it's a 1 white mana 2/1 creature. Very vanilla, but a 1 white mana 2/1 is a pretty decent start in white weenie. If you can get this down, then you are pretty much golden, as long as you've got a turn 2 play, of course, and the mana as well. But yeah, it's really good. It's also an ally as well, and we do have ourselves some core blade whirls as well that trigger off of allies, so there is a little bit of synergy in the deck in that as well. Also, plus human is quite a specific tribe in this deck as well. It is also slightly human tribal in the same sense. Next, we've got Cartouche of Solidarity. So for 1 white mana, we have an enchantment aura Cartouche. So we enchant a creature we control, and that creature gets +1/+1 and first strike. However, when it enters the battlefield, it also gets us a 1/1 white warrior token with vigilance as well. So it gets a widened board, but it also allows us to swing in through our opponent's turn 2 creatures, essentially. So if they have a Sylvan Advocate and we have an Expedition Envoy down on the battlefield, we can Cartouche up the Expedition Envoy, get ourselves a 3/2 first striker, which gets through their 2/3 Sylvan Advocate, while also adding creatures to the board to widen it up and keep that pressure going. Next, we've got Fragment Eyes. Just 1 copy of this. It's not terribly important, but I'd like to have it around if need be. So this is our enchantment and artifact removal. Gets rid of most of the enchantments and artifacts that we care about anyway. So 1 white mana for sorcery speed. Destroy target artifact or enchantment with converted mana cost 4 or less. So this destroys Sphinx's tutelage if that is the way that they're going to race us. Like Turbo Fog strategies are really bad for us, so we need to get rid of the tutelage so that we can buy ourselves some extra time and make them use all of their fogs while not gaining any board state of any kind. Also, it gets rid of Dynavolt Tower, which pretty much kills every single creature in our entire deck, so having a Dynavolt Tower down on the battlefield is completely unacceptable for us. We need to be able to get rid of it. Also gets rid of Smugglers Copter, and a lot of other things as well. There are a lot of artifact creatures, maybe a Gear Hulk or 2. Actually, it won't get rid of a Gear Hulk, scratch that. But it'll get rid of early game vehicles and things like that. Next, we've got Hanwei, a Militia Captain. So for 1 and a white, we have a 2/2 creature. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 4 or more creatures, including the Militia Captain, we get to transform the Militia Captain into the Westvale Cult Leader. So the Westvale Cult Leader has XX as its power and toughness, and that is equal to the number of creatures we control. So the wider we get, the bigger the Cult Leader gets. And this allows us to get through our opponent's bigger creatures. If they're in like a ramp strategy or something like that, we can actually make a pretty decently big creature ourselves. Maybe even give it first strike as well, so our opponent's forced to chump block all the time. Also, at the beginning of your end step, you may put a 1/1, put a 1/1 white and black human cleric token onto the battlefield. So that is a human that triggers Thalia's Lieutenant. It also gets boosted from Thalia's Lieutenant as well, and it pumps up the Cult Leader every single turn, which means the Cult Leader's constantly getting a lot larger, and we'll fight through a couple of board wipes here and there, you never know. So, we've got Thalia's Lieutenant, spoke about you briefly, but we're going to get into more detail. So for 1 and a white, we have a 1/1 creature, Human Soldier. When Thalia's Lieutenant enters the battlefield, you may put a 1/1 counter on each other human you control. As I mentioned, every single creature in this deck is a human. So every single creature that's on the field at that time will get an extra counter thanks to the Thalia's Lieutenant. And once she's down as well, whenever another human enters the battlefield, Thalia's Lieutenant herself gets a 1/1 counter as well. So we can pump up our entire board permanently, and also any follow-up creatures will pump up Thalia's Lieutenant and make her quite large, similar to the Westfield Cult Leader as well. Really awesome stuff. Next we've got Knight of the White Orchid. So this really helps if we are on the draw. So for 2 white mana, we've got a 2/2 first striking creature. When it enters the battlefield, if an opponent controls more lands than you, you may search your library for a plains card and put it onto the battlefield and shuffle your library. So if we're down on mana compared to our opponent, we get a free land into play untapped, which is pretty awesome. Which means that if our opponent's played their 3rd land, and we have a land in hand on turn 3, instead of playing that land, we play the Knight first, tapping out, getting a plains from the Knight, and then we play another land, which means we've actually got 2 mana to follow up with, so we can do some nice ramping there as well. So our turn 3 can actually play a Knight plus another 2-drop, which is awesome. It's a little less good if your opponent is on less lands than you, of course. It doesn't really do anything. And if we're on the play as well, playing this on curve can be a little bit awkward because we don't get the value from it. If we play our 2nd land, our opponent obviously only has 1 land in play. So there is opportunity to not get value from that, but it is good enough most of the time. Being a 2/2 first striker as well is nothing too bad either, just on its own. So it's good most of the time, so it's worth playing, I think. Next, we've got Glory-Bound Initiate. So for 1 and a white, we have ourselves a 3/1. Not good on its own right there. However, it does have the ability to exert itself, which essentially means when it attacks, you can exert it and it doesn't untap next turn. So when you do that, you get to give the Glory-Bound Initiate +1/+3 and lifelink, making it a 4/4 lifelinking creature for 2 mana. That is a lot of value. So we don't really want to exert it too much because we don't get to untap and use it later on, but we do have abilities like our Always Watching, which gives creatures vigilance, which means when we exert the Glory-Bound Initiate, it doesn't tap. So although we are exerting and it doesn't untap during its untap step, it doesn't need to untap to begin with. We also have Trial of Solidarity as well, alongside the cartouches, means that we can reuse that occasionally. Should have mentioned that. But yes, Glory-Bound Initiate's pretty good as long as we can give it vigilance of some sort. We also have ways of untapping it as well. Next, we've got Console's Lieutenant. This is another card that's really good on the play. As soon as possible that you can get this down, the better, because it is a 2 white mana, 2/1 first strike. It means it can get through a lot of creatures. Can't get through the Sylvan Advocates of the format, but there are a fair few that it does anyway. It has Renown 1, which means if it deals combat damage to a player, then you get to put a counter on it and it becomes Renowned. This is really important for the Lieutenant. This is the key to this card being good, essentially. If we can Renown this card, we're in a really good shape. Because when it attacks, if it is Renowned, other attacking creatures you control get +1/+1 until the end of the turn. So if we make this into a 3/2 first striker, whenever it attacks, every other creature gets +1/+1, which makes this a 4/2. This is a 3/3 first striker. This is a 3/3, you know, so on and so forth. It's really good, and a 3/2 first striker is pretty awesome as well as a 2-drop. So it's pretty cool. Next, we've got Core Blade Whirl. So for 1 and a white, we have ourselves a 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, or another ally enters the battlefield under your control, creatures you control get first strike until the end of the turn. So if our opponent's playing a token strategy, and we have a lot of 1 toughness creatures, we need to be able to give our creatures first strike whenever possible, so that we deal combat damage first, killing their creatures. So Core Blade Whirl's really good for that kind of thing. Enters the battlefield by itself to give everything first strike. However, we also have Expedition Envoys as well as an extra ally to do that for us as well. Next, we've got Topan Freeblade, an auto-include in any white weenie strategy. So it is a 1 and a white 2/2 with Vigilance, but it also has Renown 1 as well. When this creature deals combat damage to a player, if it isn't Renowned, you get to put a 1/1 counter on it, and it becomes Renowned. So if we get our hits in on turn 2, we get to make this into a 3/3 Vigilance creature, which is pretty awesome. We can also give it loads of auras as well, which pumps it up even further. Nimbus Wings to make it a flying Vigilance creature, which means it blocks almost everything we need it to block. So it's just really good value all the time. It's pretty awesome. If we can get a Topan Freeblade with an Angelic Destiny on it, it's usually just GG right there as well. So it's a 6/6 just on its own with flying, first strike and vigilance. and then it'll become a 7/7, and our opponent will be dead in a few turns just off of that alone. Next we've got Smugglers Copter. So for 2 mana we have a 3/3 artifact vehicle. This card is very important to us because we need to be able to draw well. We need to get really lucky on our draws essentially, and Smugglers Copter allows us to get a little bit luckier. If we draw into extra lands, for example, we can loot away those lands to draw into more creatures. So one thing this deck struggles with is board wipes. So if your opponent wipes the board, we're in trouble. So Smuggler's Copter allows us to keep our hand full of creatures all of the time. It's also a creature that sits on the side as well, so it survives a board wipe and can come back to attack no matter what creature we end up pulling, which is pretty sweet. So yeah, when it attacks or blocks, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. It's a 3/3 in the air, which is a lot of damage as well. Next, we got 2 copies of Grasp of the Hieromancer. So for 1 and a white enchantment aura, you get to enchant a creature, and when the enchanted creature gets +1/+1, and when it attacks, you get to tap a creature target player controls. So let's say we need to get our Lieutenant renowned, so we stick a Grasp of the Hieromancer on it or another creature that's going to be attacking this turn. Tap down our opponent's only blocker, allowing us to renown our creatures, thus progressing our board state, making a bigger threat for our opponent. Suddenly means that they can't just simply leave back one creature to block, they need to leave back multiple creatures in order to do that. And we get to choose which one gets tapped as well, so we get to decide which creatures our opponent is forced to block with later on in the game, because we will be getting our opponent down to a low life total to force chump blocks if everything is going well. So being able to choose which creature our opponent's forced to block with is really good, awesome value, so it's really awesome. Next we've got Nimbus Wings. So for 1 and a white enchantment aura, enchanted creature gets +1/+2 and has flying. So we've mentioned before we need to get in as much damage as possible, so if our opponent does end up clogging up the ground, we can actually give a Free Blade or any other creature +1/+2 and flying so that we can start swinging in over the top. We get ourselves a 3/4 on its own with a Free Blade, which becomes a 4/5 that survives a Languish if we manage to renown our Free Blades, so it's pretty sweet. And a 4/5 pretty much blocks everything as a vigilant creature as well, so it really slows our opponent down, which buys us turns. But the Nimbus Wings can also allow us to use our exert creatures more often as well. So exerting might not be the best value for maybe, say, a Devoured Cropmate who doesn't actually gain any power and toughness when it exerts, but it does have some extra value we need to make good use of. So being able to make that into a 4/4 flyer and get creatures back every single turn is pretty sweet. Next we've got Blessed Alliance. So for 1 and a white instant speed, it has Escalate, but we'll get to that in a second. We get to choose 1 or more modes. So the first mode, we get to gain 4 life, or target player does. We might want to point at our opponent if we're feeling cheeky. We can also untap 2 target creatures, which is really useful with Exert. If we've just exerted our creatures, then we can untap them on our opponent's turn to use them as combat tricks, or even just so that we can exert them the turn after. And we can also use it as removal as well, so target opponent sacrifices an attacking creature. If they're only getting in with 1 creature, we can kill it. If they're getting in with multiples, then we get them to sacrifice a creature, but we can't decide which one it is. It's up to them to decide that. So, as I mentioned, this card does have Escalate, which means that we get to pay an additional cost to use one or more of, use an extra one of these modes. So let's say that we want to make our opponent sacrifice a creature, but we also want to untap our creatures so that we can attack next turn. Well, we end up paying an extra 2 on top of the Blessed Alliance, so 4 total, to untap 2 creatures, force our opponent to sack a creature. Maybe one of those 2 that we untapped blocks the extra creature that they're saving as well, so we can blow our opponent out quite nicely with the Blessed Alliance. Next we've got Declaration in Stone, so for 1 and a white sorcery speed, exile target creature and all other creatures its controller controls with the same name as that creature. That player investigates for each non-token creature exiled this way. So this is here for the token strategies that really clog up the board and stop us getting our power in, essentially. So if our opponent's got themselves a Nissa and they're generating loads of plant tokens, we can kill all of them in one go with the Declaration in Stone and maybe swing through to our opponent to kill their Nissa. If they've got a Gideon down, we kill all of their ally tokens. If it's zombies, we kill all of their zombie tokens. There's a lot of applications for Declaration in Stone. Plus, it also is a decent removal for any embalm creatures as well. They come back as tokens, and our opponent doesn't get to investigate for any token that gets destroyed. That being said, it's not just for tokens. It can be also used against Ulamogs and things like that. If our opponent's using an Ulamog, it's probably game over anyway, but Declaration in Stone allows us to essentially kill any creature at sorcery speed, which sorcery speed's not ideal, but, you know, we take what we can get. Next, we've got Devoured Cropmate. So for 2 and a white, a 3/2 creature is pretty good. It dies to a fair few things. However, it's not there to get in combat damage for the most part. It's actually here to rebuild our board. So let's say our opponent has wiped our board, and we have a Cropmate in hand. When we attack with the Cropmate, we may exert it, and as it attacks, when you do, we get to return a creature with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So, converted mana cost 2 or less is essentially every single creature in our graveyard. That's a free blade, a blade whirl, so we get to give this first strike as a little bit of a combat trick as well if we get the blade whirl back. We can give a Consul's Lieutenant back, maybe, so that we can swing in later. Glory-bound Initiate, so that we can exert with it next turn. If we get a Knight back, we get to ramp with it. If we get Thalia's Lieutenant back, we get to pump up the Cropmate as well, make it a 4/3. There are a lot of applications for the Cropmate. Plus, if we can give it Vigilance, we can start doing this every single turn as well. Things like the Always Watching, which we'll get to in a second. But also, Nimbus Wings will allow us to rebuild our board quickly by having an unblockable Cropmate. For the most part, anyway. Our opponent's not likely to be running creatures that can kill the Cropmate, so being able to exert as a flyer is pretty sweet. So, we've got ourselves 2 copies of Always Watching. So for 1 and 2 white, this is an enchantment. Really good in this deck, even before exert was a thing. Non-token creatures you control get +1/+1 and have Vigilance. So, you may notice a glaring issue with some of our creatures that they have 1 toughness. Well, Always Watching allows us to get rid of that glaring issue and make them 2 toughness so that Twin Bolts don't take out 2 creatures, for example, that kind of stuff. But also, it allows us to give every single one of our creatures Vigilance, so that means we can exert creatures every single turn. So every single turn with a Cropmate, we can get back a new creature, really widen our board state, and go crazy with that kind of stuff. We can also have first striking Vigilance creatures as well, so we've got decent blockers. Glory-bound Initiate can be a 5/5 lifelinker every single attack, which is insane amount of value. So there are a lot of applications for the Always Watching. On a similar note, we've got the Trial of Solidarity. So for 2 and a white, we have an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, creatures you control get +2/+1 and gain Vigilance until the end of the turn. So this only works for a single turn, but it does pump up an extra little bit of power, which might be enough to close out the game. Also gives Vigilance as well, so we can use the exert on the turn that we use the Trial. However, it does have a secondary ability. When a cartouche enters the battlefield under your control, you may return Trial of Solidarity to its owner's hand so that we can reuse it. So we have ourselves 2 cartouches down here. These cartouches give +1/+1 and first strike, and they're only 1 white mana to bring that back. So we can play our Trial of Solidarity plus a cartouche, that's 4 mana to bounce this straight back to our hand if we want to do that. Really good value so that we can give everything +2/+1 and Vigilance again, which is awesome. Next we've got Katra the True. Not sure about this creature yet, but it does go around board wipes and it does allow us to rebuild quite quickly as well. So for 3 and a white, we have a 3/6ing double striking indestructible god, which is pretty insane. However, it cannot attack or block unless you control 3 or more creatures. So, other creatures, should I say. So we need 4 creatures total, including Katra. So, as we said, we've got a fair few cheap creatures, so the likelihood of us having about 4 creatures is pretty good. Even if we don't, we have a secondary ability as well, so have 3 and a white to create a 1/1 white warrior creature token with Vigilance, which is essentially what the cartouche does as well. So, if we manage to get to that point, we have ourselves a 3/6 double striking indestructible creature, dealing 6 every turn if our opponent doesn't block it. Pretty much killing every single creature in the format as well if they chump block with it. So Katra has the potential to be really good. Not sure if we will see too much value out of her. There are obviously occasions where she is utterly useless. Post board wipe, she can be a little bit slow, but she can get us back into the game, I suppose, as well. So next we've got Angelic Destiny. We've briefly touched upon this. We have a 2 and a double white enchantment aura. So we get to enchant a creature. This enchantment on its own is probably going to win a game. So the creature that we enchant gets +4/+4, has first strike and flying, and is an angel in addition to its other types. That is irrelevant. However, the +4/+4 flying and first strike essentially means any single creature that we play is going to be really bad for our opponent to deal with. If our opponent wants to deal with it and tries to remove the creature itself, then Angelic Destiny comes back to our owner's hand, so that we can recast it on a different creature the turn after. So this is reusable auras as well, which is pretty sweet. Finally, we've got Gideon, ally of Zendikar. So for 2 and 2 white, we have a 4 loyalty planeswalker. The main use for Gideon is to go wide on the board. So for 0, we get to put a 2/2 white knight ally token onto the battlefield. Ally triggers the Blade Whirls, so everything gets first strike, which is pretty sweet. But it also goes wide to protect himself, goes wide so that we can put up extra pressure, use the Summoning Sick ally token maybe to crew a Smugglers Copter, that kind of thing. We can also plus Gideon as well. +1 allows him to become a 5/5 ally creature with Indestructible that is still a planeswalker. You prevent all damage that would be dealt to him. So a 5/5 pretty much means your opponent's chump blocking every single turn, which is pretty sweet. It's what we want to be doing, especially by turn 4. We want to be closing out the game. So getting a 5/5, sorry, into the play for 4 is pretty sweet. The -4 is kind of useful as well. We get an emblem with creatures you control get +1/+1. So as I mentioned, the good use of the Always Watching to stop certain burn spells on our 1 toughness creatures. Well, Gideon's ultimate allows us to pump up our creatures as well permanently, which is pretty sweet. So that is essentially the deck. Let's go over to the lands. We've got 18 planes. Speaks for itself. We're white Weenie. We want to keep our land count quite low. But we're also running Westvale Abbey as well. So this is a colourless land. It's not too much of a problem in this deck, although if you hit a Westvale Abbey plus the planes on turn 2, then you're not going to be able to get your Lieutenant down. So it is a little finicky occasionally, but I think the value you can get off of it in the late game is worth it. So it adds colourless mana. You can pay 5 and tap it to pay 1 life and put a 1/1 white and black human cleric token onto the battlefield, which pumps up Thalia's Lieutenant, which is pretty cool. And also, if we have 5 creatures on the battlefield, we can pay 5, tap it, sacrifice 5 creatures, and transform it into Omendal the Profane Prince. This is a 9/7 legendary creature with flying, lifelink, and indestructible, plus haste. So we get to swing with it the turn it comes out, which is awesome. So a 9/7 flying over the top is probably just going to win the game for you. Even if it doesn't, it's going to gain you enough life to win in a future turn, even if your opponent wants to keep swinging in over and over and over again. Anyway guys, that's going to do it for the deck. If you did enjoy the look of the deck, be sure to check out the matches. As I mentioned, apologies for the late upload of this video. Hopefully the matchups that you are going to see will make up for this. If not, I apologize. And I will see you in the matches, guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe as well. And hit that little bell icon as well to be notified when the next videos go up. Alright guys, see you in a bit. Bye.